I will just ask the class a question at the end. And I do have one question to start. Can anyone tell me what another word for hypersensitive immune reaction is? I think we've talked about it in this class, hypersensitive immune reaction.
That was quick.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh,
Yeah.
okay, awesome. Thank you. Anybody? All right, another word for hypersensitive immune reaction is allergy. And I'm going to basically tell you in my in my talk today how autism is actually an allergic reaction. So autism in America is a personal journey and a sociological critique. I, being a late diagnosed autistic person, have found in my experience the way that autism affects me personally the most is socially. And so when I went back to school 3 years ago, I have been doing probably the most autistic thing ever, making autism my special interest. One of the traits of autistic people is they tend to get very hyper-focused on things that they get really interested about. And so autism has basically been my focus of study for the last 3 years that I've been going to school. What I discovered initially when I was majoring in psychology is that the field of psychology tends to exclude social factors from their diagnoses and symptom criteria. And so I very quickly switched my major to sociology then to study autism from a sociological perspective. And when we do that, we find that autism actually makes more sense as a reflection of the cultures that we find it in rather than a personal defect. So autism exists at the intersection of biology, trauma, and culture. And my work then brings together neuroscience, anthropology, sociology, and my own personal narrative to show that these traits are reflective of the conditions of their environment, which may relate actually to the overabundance of mirror neurons that is associated with autism. But by approaching autism through this relational and trauma-informed lens, we discover that the problem is not actually individuals, but their environment themselves. So I developed a framework using critical medical anthropology, which reveals that diagnosis and treatment are shaped by power, inequality, and our cultural assumptions about behavior. And autism then is pathologized because society prioritizes behaviors that autism reflects values of a culture obsessed with productivity and conformity rather than connection. Sorry, so integrated theoretical model, there we go. I basically just completely stole this from Bonnie. She had a slide just the other week actually, so you can kind of see what I did here. I took the integrated theoretical model and then applied it to autism. So we're looking then at the political ecology, evolutionary culture, developmental, cultural niche, all of the different factors, as opposed to the biomedical model, which tends to look at the body to the exclusion of everything else. So this integrated model then links the nervous system, trauma, culture, and our social structure, and it shows how the autistic traits emerge where the nervous system and genetic sensitivity meet societal fragmentation. Sociology and the vagus nerve, one of the things that I've been studying in sociology for my major is the link between the vagus nerve, the body's social safety system, and its functioning with the exterior emotional climate around us. So basically the idea here is that when societies become more authoritarian, fascist, or just really stressful, nervous systems are going to react more strongly to that environment. So then with that logic in mind, we would tend to imagine the autism rates would be going up in more capitalist colonial environments. I'm going to, for the sake of time, run through the biological aspects really quickly because my work tends to focus more on the social. But I did underline and put in bold some commonalities. So while I'm going through this, I want you to specifically look at the words that are in bold and underlined here. We discovered in class there's a link between the Helminth parasites and autism. There's also, this picture is from a leaky gut study, but you can see there's the vagus nerve and there's some immunity stuff going on there. This also links to our talks that we've discussed about Toxoplasma gondii infections, because T. gondii can cause gut dysbiosis, which in turn leads to the compromised intestinal barrier and affects, again, the vagus nerve and that gut-brain barrier. We have glial cells, which, again, are inflammatory response, synaptic pruning deficits in autism. They're known to have more synapses because the pruning process is disrupted. Well, when we look at the actual pruning process being disrupted, the disruption there is, again, an immune response. We have an overabundance of synapses in early childhood, and also a overabundance of mirror neurons. And what this basically means is that when the social environment is inconsistent or emotionally unstable, the mirror neurons adapt in a trauma response fight or flight pattern. Autism as a cultural mirror. So my work essentially establishes that autism is then reflecting social instability. One second, I'm fast forwarding here. And reflects rising social disconnection and chronic stress in any given culture. There's actually quite a bit that goes into the criteria that I developed when establishing this framework, but I'll go back a slide. I do jokingly refer to this as my Pee Wee Herman theory, because I know you are, but what am I? When we're looking at the social ecology of a culture, again, there are a lot of different components that go into that, but I feel that identity and language are the two things that I'm going to focus on for our talk today. As far as the linguistic component, language shapes reality, including identity and the ways we understand ourselves in the world. I took a quarter of linguistic anthropology, and I would highly recommend that class to everyone, but the Sapir-Whorf theory basically talks about how our linguistic shapes our experience of the world. And the English language, specifically used by settler colonists, is very egotistical. It's a subject, verb, object language, and so because it puts the subject first, it creates a separation between an individual and the world around them, whereas indigenous languages tend to be relational, which leads to a interdependent and systemic understanding of the world. Deficit-based language is specifically colonial, and pathologizing behavior is specifically unique to Western psychiatry. that's not something that naturally occurs in indigenous populations. So the theory here then is that in an oppressive social environment that is going to impact genetics, which then impact the synapse expression, and then it impacts the epigenetics, and it kind of goes around in this big cellular colonial loop, basically, where our hunter-gatherer genetics, which we've discussed in this class through the discordant hypothesis, is out of whack with our current society. We're getting activated into this hypersensitive immune reaction, basically, which we saw in the previous slides in regards to the biological. We're seeing a lot of immune response all over the body, right? As part of this, I developed a framework called the collective nervous system, where communities function like individual nervous systems, basically. So when society becomes dysregulated, then communities become dysregulated, and again, it kind of acts in a big self-feeding loop. Relational harm always scales into systemic harm. So the issues that autistic people face, such as misunderstanding, invalidation, or coercion, are mirroring the larger conflicts and inequalities in our society. Colonization itself is an act of breaking down a larger unit into smaller fragments. Identity becomes shaped by colonial narratives about productivity, normality, determination, and self-control. And these imposed narratives disconnect people from their communities and themselves. So decolonizing our identity then means understanding oneself as part of the larger system and learning to identify relationally with that whole of humanity. In regards to the ecology of connection, another idea that I've been developing is that humans have evolved in cooperative, interdependent communities. When these ecological conditions break down, autistic traits become more noticeable and more stressed. So the ecology of connection explains how safety, belonging, and co-regulation shape environment and these body's immune responses. Fragmented environments, like stressful, dysfunctional homes, isolated rural communities, or coercive institutions and systems, all tend to overwhelm our nervous system, both on an individual and a collective level, which disrupts human development. Autism reflects the emotional cost of living in a fragmented social condition because their nervous systems are the most sensitive. They are essentially canary in the coal mine. Their symptoms are essentially a call to action for society, signaling its dysfunctional environment. It is important to note that abusers and toxic systems only retain power because the rest of us have been trained to look away and distance ourselves from the suffering of others, but it's also important to note that violence is learned and prevention works when we change the norms, attitudes, and systems that enable it. Here you can see on the left, this is a map by Solmi et al. This is autism prevalence, and you can see pretty clearly that autism prevalence is mapping colonial history. It solidly is mirroring this second map we have in the middle here, which is actually the amount of post-traumatic medical devices being sold worldwide, and the United States is responsible for 58% of that. I contrasted these two studies with Mary Ainsworth's Strange Situations study, which looked at infants in Uganda and infants in the United States, and she was unable to replicate her study in Uganda because the attachment of infants in the United States had been so normalized, the babies were not looking for caregivers for soothing or for help here in the United States. So that's pretty significant because what that's basically showing, these three maps together, is this is basically showing that here we have the United States essentially creating this traumatic social environment. They're selling these remedies back to their citizens after they're kind of being traumatized by this environment they're in, and that traumatized environment then is causing the autism rates to skyrocket in response to that. I developed a dual pathway model because a lot of the research currently coming out in regards to autism right now is talking about how it's relating to DNA that is connected to Neanderthal or Denisovian, basically the discordant hypothesis, right? They're saying there's hunter-gatherer DNA, and it's related to these immune reactions that we're seeing here. So my dual pathway model basically is saying that there are people who are autistic, but what that autism basically is a genetic predisposition that may or may not be active, but because of the social environment being so stressful, they're essentially being clicked on these genes like a light switch. So some babies, they're born into that environment and their genes, they've already been clicked on by birth. Some babies, they are born and they, due to that accumulation of traumas being in that environment, tend to become more autistic or get a late diagnosis later on in life. I've also developed, as a part of my work in sociology here, autistic standpoint theory. Standpoint theory was developed by feminists. Patricia Hill Collins basically said that standpoint theory is a great way of evaluating power when you look at the people who are most affected by power discrepancies at the bottom of the hierarchy. My theory, autistic standpoint theory, is basically saying the same thing, only socially, because autism is defined by social deficits. What I'm saying is if you view the autistic experience as a cultural mirror to look at how it's reflecting those social deficits, it actually effectively shows us where we need to fix our society as a whole. The other thing that I've developed is mirror integration theory, which is basically an offshoot of autistic standpoint theory, but it's saying that individuals and societies are mirroring each other, and personal fragmentation is mirroring social fragmentation and vice versa. So the theory would be then that healing at one level is supporting healing at another, and autism sits at that intersection. One other thing that I've developed theoretically in my book is the functional conflict theory. What I've discovered as a sociology student is studying a bunch of theories by old dead white guys, basically, is that they were kind of picking apart pieces of the puzzle trying to describe the world around them, but it's all very colonial, it's all non-indigenous, and so my book basically takes a stab at what would social theory look like if it was indigenous. And in fact, what you essentially get if you are hypothetically having indigenous theory is a combination of both functional and conflict theory. The functional part basically stating that conflict is not necessarily something to be avoided like Western society currently treats it right now. And interestingly enough, that theory parallels a lot of the indigenous ways of knowing and being and resolving conflicts with each other. So I want to talk a little bit about the strengths and weaknesses of my book. I wrote this book at the beginning of the summer. It's about 800 pages. This was basically what I did while going to school full-time this summer. I wrote this in response to the current government and administration because they seem to be taking a swing at the autistic community right now, and I thought that it would be good if the autism community had somewhat of a personal narrative. So I put together this book, and it is, I think there's like 100 pages of references. So this is essentially a 3-year ethnographic study. This is the last 3 years of my college experience. And one of the reasons why I wanted to put all of that into a book was to make it more accessible for people who, like me, are first generation and maybe can't afford to go to college. I've also learned that as a late diagnosed autistic person, there's a significant paywall. You actually can't get specific information even about yourself or your own condition unless you go to college. And I was pretty incensed when I learned that, and so I put it all in a book. And it is available on Amazon. It's on Kindle Unlimited for free right now, but I've also made it for free on ResearchGate. So if you're a student and you want any of this information, go to ResearchGate, it's for free. But I will note that there are some pretty significant weaknesses to this book. The first and foremost is that I've been writing it while actively recovering from PTSD. So some of the information here might have a survivorship bias, and some of it may be fairly recursive, and some of it may be repetitive. But I did the best that I could. I want to talk a little bit about embodied theory, because all of the theories that I just talked about that I developed were developed from personal experience. These are things that I first and foremost applied to my own family. And as you can see in my son's last year of schooling, he has had a 66% reduction in destructive behaviors within the first 90 days of applying these theories. And he's also had a 329% average typical academic growth in 1 year, which is fairly significant. Since 2024, which is when I got emergency custody of him because my children were removed from their father's home and placed with me from the state. He arrived with some pretty significant behavioral concerns, but since 2024, he's been stable and he's been doing really great. In addition to him, there's also me. I've been self-applying my own theories, and prior to coming to school 3 years ago, I had dropped out of school 4 times. I had never been able to be successful in college. Since applying these theories to my own life and becoming an embodied theorist, I have gotten numerous awards, lots of scholarships, and I've been doing really great in school. So, in conclusion, autism is a relational and cultural signal that tells us about the health of our society. Therefore, healing autism requires healing the ways we relate to each other and our cultural narratives around differences. The future of autism is clearly tied to the future of our collective healing. I would just like to then lead the class in a philosophical question then. So I took philosophy in my first quarter back at school just because I thought it would be really healthy and helpful in the trauma recovery to kind of get my brain back in the right frame. But I love the if and the then. So if something is true, then something else must be true, right? So if autism is actually an allergy to the social environment, then the quote-unquote cure for autism would be
what do you think? What would you guess? I would say a healing of the social environment.
Yeah, my book, my whole entire book focuses on decolonial theory, and really it comes down to decolonizing. Thank you so much. Thank you.